Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Archive by noah.beier. This is a history podcast in which I discuss all sorts of themes out of the past 120 years and how they affected history and formed our current world. In today's episode, we will be talking about the beginnings of aviation and the early days of military aviation. And in an upcoming episode, we then will be talking about aviation and how it was used during the Cold War. That as a little teaser ahead. Okay, as always, I would like to present you a book that you can use for further reading on the theme that we discussed in the episode. And today I'm going to give you The Aircraft book by DK, also out of the Definitive Visual History series, just like the train book that I recommended to you in the previous episode where we talked about trains. The book has several contributors, and I have left a link in the show notes, just like all the other sources and all the other material that I used in preparation for this podcast. Okay, flight has always been kind of an obsession with humanity. Humans always wanted to try and fly and be like the birds. Early flying machines, by the likes of those designed by Leonardo da Vinci, never really got off the ground because they tried to replicate the flying movement and motions made by birds. These attempts all failed, but some wonderful inventors during the 18th century came to the idea of using a hot air balloon. The result was the Montgolfier hot air balloon, which was one of the earliest means of getting off the ground. But this was not controlled flight yet. One could not control where the balloon would go. It would just go up into the air and be moved around by the wind. These days, of course, we can at least estimate where a balloon is going to go by the wind directions that we can calculate out of our wonderful weather forecasts. So if we take a given point where we're going to launch the balloon, and we know how fast it will rise, we know how the wind at any given altitude will be, and how it then will respond accordingly, and where it will then land. But of course, all that was very, very far away. And in the 19th century, first attempts with gliders took shape. Men like Sir George Cayley and the German Otto Lilienthal built the world's first functioning gliders. Otto Lilienthal was the first to more or less mass-produce a sort of aircraft that was controllable. His gliders were controllable by shifting of the body weight, and I've left a picture in the show notes. And what I mean with mass production is that at least 9 of his normal apparatus were built. Sadly, Otto Lilienthal died in a crash with one of his gliders in 1896, and the last words he issued to his brother were, "Sacrifices must be made." Displays quite nicely what kind of person Otto Lilienthal was. He was a pioneer who drove innovation, and he offered his life to that cause. Only 7 years after Otto Lilienthal's death, the Wright brothers built their first aircraft, the Flyer. It was just called. It was the first aircraft that flew with some form of motive power driving it through the air. It was also controllable through fins and elevators. In the year 1909, innovation had reached a point where the Frenchman Louis-Berlioz, and I hope that I'm pronouncing this correctly, crossed the British Channel with the Berlioz 11 aircraft, a biplane which would set the principal template for aircrafts to come, with a propeller at the front and wings and a landing gear, and a long frame going out from behind the cockpit. Of course, the military interest in aviation was soon recognized, but at the time, most military spendings were used for building huge battleships or artillery or recruiting more soldiers. So aircraft fell more or less into the quote-unquote experimental sector. Aircraft were not recognized as a legitimate weapon until World War I was already underway. Most aircraft first really entered their useful service after 1916, when the war had already been going on for a little while. At first, these aircraft used in World War I were mainly for reconnaissance missions, and further on in the war, generals realized the potential that if you could fly an aircraft over enemy territory to observe troop movements, you could also have the pilot or the co-pilot drop improvised bombs or hand grenades from the aircraft to detonate in enemy territory. And then, of course, the counter idea is that if one aircraft is going to attack you with bombs, you need another aircraft to shoot it down. So if my territory is getting attacked by an aircraft that is going to drop bombs on me, or a bomber as it is called, I'm going to need an aircraft with guns to shoot the bomber down. Now the idea to counter that is that I escort the bomber with a fighter to fight against the fighter that is trying to shoot down the bomber. And this idea or this concept would stick on. Later, things like the fighter bomber would evolve, where you basically roll both of these types of aircraft into one. The first successful fighter aircraft, at least in British aviation, were the SE-5A. The E stands for experimental, that's the point that I emphasized earlier, and the Sopwith Camel. The SE-5A was known to be a stable gun platform with its two different guns that could both be fired by just the pilot, and also the Sopwith Camel, which was a much more agile aircraft. So two different roles, and these two aircraft are also often related to the later Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, the two primary aircraft, or the two primary fighter aircraft in the Battle of Britain for the United Kingdom. So let's talk a little bit about exactly that Battle of Britain. I will probably make an entire episode just about this at some point in time. I am currently planning that as this is going to be a seasonized format of a show, the next season will be about World War One, and then season 3 will be about World War II, and from there we will have to have a look. But if you have ideas out there on how I should structure the future seasons, then my podcasting email address is in the show notes or in the description. So if you have ideas, critique, or anything else, you can write to me there. So today I'm only going to give a brief account of the Battle of Britain, just to emphasize the point of a fighter aircraft. So the Battle of Britain came about shortly after the end of the Battle of France, in which the French suffered a massive defeat at the hand of Nazi Germany. And due to some unknown reason, Hitler stopped his troops, who were at the time chasing the British and French soldiers towards the coast. And what was resulted was the events of Dunkirk, in which the Allied forces were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk and were evacuated by the United Kingdom's army and navy in Operation Dynamo. Shortly after, Hitler turned his sights to the last big remaining power in Europe, aside from the Soviet Union, whom he'd signed a peace deal with. And that only other foe was Great Britain. And his idea was, roughly speaking, to gain air superiority over Britain, make sure that he patrolled the skies so that he could bomb down all the military institutions and bases, and make sure that the supply lines are cut, the railway stations are bombed, and make sure that there won't be a big defensive move when he and the army march in over the channel with a big landing operation. This operation was titled Operation Sea Lion, and it had to get postponed because German fighter aircraft could not gain air superiority over Britain. And this might seem odd if you look at the numbers, seeing that the Royal Air Force was much smaller than the German Luftwaffe. So, how did the British Royal Air Force then win the Battle of Britain? First of all, they made use of a very new technology at the time, radar, which is basically a technology where you send out radio waves and listen for the rebounding signals of an object. With this method, you can detect aircraft several thousand miles away, at least at today's standards. For Great Britain's standards of the time, they could detect a German aircraft coming to fly over the North Sea towards the British mainland. So the radar stations would then transmit this information to RAF headquarters, who in turn sent attacking orders with coordinates to the Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane bases that could deploy the Spitfires. But in order for this plan to work, you needed an aircraft that could gain altitude fast enough, because of course the incoming aircraft were also not slow. So they, from the moment that you detect them on radar, they were of course also keeping on the move. So you needed an aircraft that could gain altitude quickly, and that once reaching that altitude was also fast and agile to take up combat with the equally advanced Messerschmitt 109. So how did the Spitfire accomplish this? One factor that is often brought up in regard to the Spitfire is its pretty unique elliptic wing. This is one thing that, of course, immediately sticks out when you look at a photograph of the Spitfire. The elliptical wing provided for several things. It decreased the drag forces generated by an effect that occurs when the high pressure air and the low pressure air on either sides of the wing that generate lift mix at the tips of the wing. This effect is lessened if the wing tip is curved. So an elliptic shape is optimal for this application. Also, you might be thinking, then why don't you just make a long sort of plank shape wing with a rounded end? That would also defeat the problem of these vortexes building up. Well, a wing like that doesn't have enough room for all the equipment that has to fit inside. The elliptic shape gives you the opportunity to fit more equipment in, like the landing gear that had to fold in to defeat air resistance issues, the different guns that you needed if you were going to go up against the 109s, and also other technical equipment that had to be stored in the wing. Also, there was more room for supporting structure, which allowed the wing to be exposed to more G-forces, which is of course important for an agile fighter aircraft. But there was of course another very vital factor, and that was the ever iconic Merlin engine. The Merlin engine had to be, on the one hand, light to make sure that the aircraft is not too heavy, because a heavy aircraft, aside from eating fuel, also makes the turning radius larger. That is the radius in which an aircraft can turn 180 degrees. A heavier aircraft is harder to turn quickly. So the Merlin engine had to be light, because the engine block is of course one of the things that is typically the heaviest on board an aircraft. So if you can reduce weight on that, it makes life much simpler. But the 27-liter engine, which is a determination of how much volume the cylinders move in and out of inside the motor, had to also, of course, provide enough power to propel the aircraft at fast enough speeds to intercept the 109s and their accompanying bombers, and also have enough power output to be agile, because for an agile aircraft you need extra power to use on turning and banking moves. And all this was achieved by using various techniques like double supercharging and similar technologies. All of these technologies could be, of course, tested and used in aircraft races like the Snyder Trophy event, which is a large aircraft racing event. And now you might say, well, the Germans probably also competed in these events, didn't they? Well, they didn't, because they were prohibited to do so via the Versailles Treaty. Which is interesting, because the Versailles Treaty was, of course, broken by Hitler and the Wehrmacht basically the day he came to power. not immediately, but military spendings immediately exploded and the development of all sorts of weapons started off. So you might say, well, the Versailles Treaty is basically not important at all because it was disregarded on all levels. Well, you have to keep in mind that it was kept strictly during the Weimar Republic, which preceded the Nazi regime from 1918 to 1933. Germany was basically entirely demilitarized, except for a very small army that had very few technologies at its disposal. And the companies in Germany were, of course, prohibited from taking part in events like the Snyder Trophy, where military technology or future military technologies could, of course, be tested excellently by companies like Supermarine, who would build the Spitfire. So this was a little outtake out of the early days of military aviation, and we will probably dive in further into the Battle of Britain, and also, if you want, to the aviation war in World War One in future episodes. But today I wanted to give a general overview over those early developments, and in the next episode we will be looking at the developments that took place after World War II, of course, with the jet aircraft, but of course what role a nuclear bomber played in the nuclear strategy of the superpowers in the Cold War. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, I would be very happy if you could subscribe to the podcast channel on your respective podcast site, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and also on YouTube if you want to listen to the episodes and don't have to always click onto the picture links to see the pictures and graphics that I use in the episodes. And I also have a WhatsApp channel where you can stay updated about episode releases, and I plan on some other fun things on the WhatsApp channel. And of course, if you have any ideas or criticism or praise for the show, then the email address is also in the show notes. I hope that you have a wonderful week. My name is Noah Beier. Bye!